My name is Kavita Patel. I'm the Policy Program Director. This is a program webinar series around policy issues that are hot and important, and today could not have been a more hot topic around the regulation and reimbursement for lab developed tests. And this is something that I'm incredibly honored to have these three great co-participants who are going to take us through some of what I would say are some subtle areas about the recently released FDA LDT proposed rule, but then also some very obvious questions. And I'm just you can all, if you're watching this webinar, kind of read and look at their bios. Some of you may know them already, but just to highlight, starting from left to right, Bruce Quinn, who's a principal at Bruce Quinn Associates, Sandra Ruggles, and she's the director of policy research for the Byers Center Policy Program. That's a lot of words. And then Susan Van Meter, who is the president of the American Clinical Labs Association. And also just all three of these individuals are incredible kind of forces for policy and change, and have independently and collectively through organizations they're affiliated with contributed a great amount, I think, to not only where the FDA has kind of gotten to, but also like the insights that we're going to share with you today. October 3rd is when the FDA published what I would say might have been the most anticipated proposed rule in the making, kind of a long time coming. This is after Congress failed to pass what was called the VALID Act. And I think Susan is going to get into just kind of what that means, why did that fail? But subsequently, kind of the FDA had always indicated this interest in regulation of LDTs and trying to think about kind of overall reforms in what I would say are the diagnostic space, particularly the in vitro diagnostic space. The FDA signaled that they wanted to do this by also continuing to support kind of this, it's a balance the FDA has to do as an independent agency inside of the administration, inside of the government, to try to balance this with what legislators have been putting into place for a long time. I myself have worked on issues leading to VALID over 15 years ago, I can admit. So what did the FDA come through with? And again, in the interest of not reading this, I'm going to just highlight a couple of things that what the FDA is trying to do by statute. I'm not the attorney here, but I've read enough and kind of worked on statute enough to understand where they are trying to make changes to their existing regulation, what's known as 21 CFR 809(3). And this is really around definitions of in vitro diagnostic products. So it's a subtle change in the sense of what they're kind of proposing to the existing regulation. However, these language that follows is where you see kind of a lot of the action, where they are talking about a gradual phase out to occur in stages for the change of the definition of how they're treating kind of the LDTs. And this is ultimately what I would say the agency's words in a quote anticipates should ultimately enable in vitro diagnostics offered as lab developed tests that are supported by sound science to remain on the market. And therein lies the conundrum. What does that mean? So let's go through very briefly so we can get to our panelists. So in terms of kind of what that would mean in terms of a gradual phase out, that the policy would apply, one, to LDTs that are certified under CLIA, meet the regulatory requirements under CLIA to perform high complexity testing, even if those diagnostics do not fall within FDA's traditional understanding of an LDT, because they are not manufactured, designed, and used within a single laboratory. We'll unpack a little bit of what that means with our panelists. It should not apply to certain LDTs that have previously been outside of enforcement discretion, and kind of my interpretation there, but concurrent with others here, lab tests for emergency use authorization. I think all of us have gotten a practical road test in that during COVID. And the other additional elements, and this is credit to Susan and her incredible organization, because they made it much cleaner and they are better at PowerPoint than I am. And so this just walks through the timeline, because that gradual phase out over 4 years really does have like a lot of pieces to it. And I think from when we anticipate, and we can talk in a minute about when we anticipate the final rule to be published, then all the way through the different stages, whether it's registration and kind of listing and labeling, which you'll see like at the end of year 2, quality system requirements, kind of PMA application submission for what they would call kind of high risk LDTs, or what's known as class 3, all the way to kind of the changes for 501k de novo submission for the low to moderate risk LDTs. And think about kind of that stage 5. Obviously, like every phase is, I think, thoughtfully put out in order to kind of gradually ease the industry. And we can talk about what this means for very large companies all the way to entrepreneurs and innovators, which is something that kind of the Buyer Center has focused on for the last 20 years. For those of you who are not familiar with the Buyer Center for Biodesign, it's a center kind of nestled within Stanford, which has had a 20-year track record of education, research, and trying to really help push forward innovation through kind of a tried and tested method around like an innovation cycle that Sandy can speak to better than I can, because she was an innovation fellow and has now been teaching it and is now leading research in it. The policy program is new and is kind of an outgrowth of 20 years of innovators working in the medical technology space, and really thinking about how much policy issues can both accelerate, decelerate, sometimes pose an obstacle, sometimes pose a tailwind, and that those are just the practicality. I think Susan and Bruce and Sandy can all agree that there's an incredible amount of policy issues that influence every stage, and none better than talking through kind of the Food and Drug Administration's kind of regulations over LDTs. So this is kind of what's next, and we'll get into some of this. Most of this is just some of my interpretation, just having worked in like several decades on a lot of these policies, but more than what is stated here. I will say that we hope that the FDA finalizes this rule next year, so 2024. I inserted this question, but I think all of our panelists, probably are thinking the same thing, that can we get the final rule out before, prior to the beginning of kind of the Congressional Review Act period in the 2024 election? I hope so, because that's the only way that we can kind of start this gauntlet of the phase in and the years that it will take to do all of this work. There are likely to be court challenges. That is already kind of being spoken about even before kind of the proposed language came out. And then I think that much like valid, and I'm going to tee this up as a question for Susan after we go through just kind of initial reactions from all the panelists. I mean, there's a question about, could this rulemaking, and this happens a lot, could it actually spur that renewed interest in valid? And I'll say I worked with Senator Burr, who was probably more instrumental. People who don't know that the EUA and that authority that exists, that kind of public health emergency authority that exists in the FDA, would not have happened without Richard Burr. And I think it's an exemplary, I think that it's an example where people see in the media kind of partisan Democrats versus Republicans or vice versa. That's actually not how real things get done. And behind the scenes, what happens are staff like myself in a former life and others sit down with people kind of quote across the aisle to get work done. Burr exemplified that. And when it came to issues of the FDA, he was an incredible champion. And we wouldn't have had, the EUA that we use so much and publicize so much and so widely, along with a lot of other FDA authorities and CDC authorities, without Richard Burr. This was one of the issues he was probably the best legislator to kind of lead. And so is there somebody that can take his mantle now that he's retired? To be seen, TBD. And then there's a user fee cycle kind of. So how does that get handled? I actually don't know. Some of our panelists probably have some thoughts on that. And then there's already in the proposed rule kind of language that's included that hints that academic medical centers, for which lab developed tests are just such a critical part of the work that they do, that there's already this sense that I read of kind of a, potential for carving out academic medical centers. And then what does that mean? So, all right. And then we're going to put this in the email. I want to draw the ACLA itself is an incredible resource. Bruce Quinn, who's one of our panelists that you'll meet, has what I think was a masterclass paper that's on his website. And we'll include that as a link on a follow-up email that everybody registered, including those that are on here, will receive. So let me go ahead and stop sharing and ask our panelists to turn on their videos while I Okay, somehow it magically stopped share. Oh, okay, good. It magically stopped sharing. Hopefully we can see everybody. All right, I'm going to hope that that's all right. Great. So I'm going to start, and like I said, I'm going to be the person that gets the easy job from here on and gets to moderate and just look at time and not have to do any hard thinking anymore, since I put those very small slides together. But let me do for all panelists, and then I'll go in the order that folks are on my screen, which is not everybody else's screen. But I'll start with Susan, Sandy, and then close with Bruce, just because of the order on the screen. I want to just get your initial reactions. Obviously, all three of you have read this, so this is not the first time you're seeing this information. It would be wonderful to just get initial thoughts, and then just to tee up, then we'll go into some individualized questions for each of you. But a little bit of a, when you saw this, were you kind of like, oh boy, just, so Susan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thanks for including me today. It's gratifying to be part of this panel discussion. So first and foremost, just so you have the context for my comments, the ACLA represents large commercial reference laboratories such as Mayo Clinic, ARUP at the University of Utah, LabCorp Quest, a number of esoteric labs with more discrete menus, principally in the oncology space. We have about 40 members across the country that are really able to serve patients in every community. So that's one lens through which we see this. Another key bit of background is that unlike many laboratory groups, last year, to Kavita's point, there was a lot of churn in Congress around the VALID Act. And we did actually engage rather fulsomely there. And the reason being is that we see there as being gray area in the regulatory apparatus to which laboratory developed tests are subject. There's certainly CLIA, there's oversight from CAP, there's oversight for many of our members who go through New York State, who are subject to MolDX approval to secure coverage for molecular tests in the Medicare program. So we felt it important to really engage because we thought there was a possibility that VALID could move forward. And really only through legislation can we get greater clarity on what is that regulatory apparatus, and can we make sure it is actually designed to accommodate the characteristics of diagnostics. That has been a really important principle for us. So the medical device framework, which this rule would apply to LDTs, we think is wholly ill-suited for diagnostics in general, and certainly for laboratory developed tests. LDTs are not medical devices. They're not implantables, for example. They really do, pardon me, have different characteristics that are important to understand. So we negotiated with the members of the House and Senate who are leading on this effort, and actually engaged with the agency as well around key policy areas that we think are important to any reform effort that are actually absent from this rule. So first and foremost, when we saw this rule, it's quite disappointing from the perspective that the FDA was, good partners and with stakeholders in thinking through legislation to give them that diagnostic specific authority, and to move forward with a rule that is a very blunt instrument. The timeline there that you had up, it does have a phase-in, but it is rather short when we think about how long it's going to take industry and the agency itself. And I know Bruce will speak to sort of the resources that are involved on both sides to be able to implement something like this. But it's the blunt nature of this instrument. It is simply applying that med device framework to LDTs. There is no grandfather policy, which is important when we think about how do patients actually have access to tests right now. A fair proportion of tests that are used every day are LDTs. This short timeline would make it so that all high-risk LDTs would have to have a submission into the agency inside of 3.5 years. We actually don't think that's possible for the universe of LDTs to have those submissions develop and be submitted. There's a real workforce shortage challenge element here, both for the laboratory industry as well as for the FDA, that as a practical matter makes this timeline insufficiently short. I mentioned grandfathering as well. It also lacks attributes that would actually reform the underlying med device framework to the extent the FDA can do that under the law. If we think about our colleagues in the manufacturing space that have IVDs, they do sort of struggle to exist under the medical device framework for a number of reasons. I'll just highlight one, which I'm sure is top of mind for all of us, and that is that once you get a test through the agency, whether it's a PMA, de novo, a 510K, if you want to iterate on that test post-market because you're determining that it would improve your test to add new biomarkers, for example, there are real limits in terms of what you can do with that test without going back into the agency for another 510K. That slows innovations. It's not bringing to patients the latest science that they deserve in order to drive decision-making about what is their diagnosis, what's the best treatment, how do we monitor that treatment, et cetera. So we're very concerned, in short, about the bluntness of this rule from the perspective of patient access to testing that is essential to everyday care, and the major downward impact it would have on innovation. I'll save this for later, but we also have very significant legal concerns. We frankly don't think that the FDA has the authority under current law to regulate LDTs as medical devices.
All great issues. And I think it's, I kind of buried the lead of when I went over how this is changing the actually existing kind of regs, like just that additional phrase created this kind of cataclysmic change in how we've thought about LDTs. Again, not something that we didn't have hints that this was coming, but certainly kind of had more optimism about valid passing. Sandy, your just gut reaction, initial reaction. I think I was with you when we talked about, and I think you're the one that pointed me to Bruce's paper and kind of his initial thought. I think what started out as a blog post and then turned into kind of a longer paper, but you were probably the one that alerted me to it when I said, hey, the LDT proposed language is out. What were your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Kavita. So I look at myself on this webinar and I think, okay, I'm the one who will represent that innovation community, that set of folks who are really trying to bring out something new, novel, or impactful for patient care in this space. And, you know, I think we all recognize that the LDT mechanism prior to this rule what was a way for developers to be able to gain commercial experience with a new test, to be able to offer and to build the data about how a new test was impacting patient care prior to taking it to FDA for a review and eventual decisions around coverage, and that many LDTs forwent the FDA process because they could, within the scope of an academic medical center, be able to provide a test and impact patient care with a more rapid pace of development. So I think overall, when I think about the innovation community, I have some of the same workforce concerns that I think Susan brought up around being able to have the regulatory and clinical strategists necessary to design a pathway for bringing a new test to market. And I think it is going to increase both the time and the amount of capital required for startups to be able to develop new novel diagnostics. And so between both the uncertainty around the pathway and the likely extension of timing, we may see more of a chilling effect on, even more of a chilling effect than we have already seen around diagnostic development and around innovation in this space.
All right, why don't we return to the fact of like how this is going to kind of thinking through, because we're working with innovation fellows at Stanford now, and you're, I know also separately from your life at Stanford, that this is kind of an active space, as you mentioned, of discussion. Like maybe let's talk through kind of building off of what Susan was discussing about patient access. It's something that sometimes we don't get emphasized enough. Like if we've got a group of innovators and they're really trying to think about, as part of what we teach at Stanford around what they call needs finding, kind of thinking about how like this is a very direct, like you could have a very important clinical need, but this poses a pretty significant barrier from everything from the regulatory uncertainty all the way to maybe
Mhm.
how investors would react, right? So maybe we can touch on that just to kind of think through where does this impact kind of trickle down to when people are like clinicians, entrepreneurs are thinking through what do patients really need? Because that's largely how a lot of like kind of, I would say in the last decade, critical diagnostics that I can think of, or sorry, critical LDTs and critical like tests that I can think of that have been used, um, they came out of that like dire patient need and the ability to focus both, I hate to say it just very bluntly, but it's true, money and attention, because you need researchers, you need science, and you need kind of
Mhm.
money, whether that's from an academic center, NIH research grants, DARPA grants, foundations, private sector, it all has to come together. It doesn't usually happen with just one source. So I'll plant that as a little seed there. Bruce, your initial reactions, and then we will get into some of the substance of your incredible paper in a little bit, but your just thoughts, what spurred you to, I think, take to the computer and write that blog post quickly.
Well, I try to cover FDA and CMS news quickly on a blog, so that's what led me to that. And I spent hours trying to figure out what they were actually doing and what it would actually cost and what the actual benefits would be. And in their press release, in their initial 26-page Federal Register publication, they just say kind of glibly the costs are a few $1 billion a year, the savings are $30 billion a year, and went on. And they didn't give any clue. They could have easily included an extra page about how they got those costs and benefits, and they chose not to. So you had to go to footnote 34, which is a 127-page online document, and dig down to page 96 or 97 to table 37, row 4. And then you find the actual costs within a few years are $40 billion. And they say the cost of a regulatory person all loaded is $300,000. So you get that they're expecting 130,000 man years or person years of regulators, 130,000 person years within a couple years. Didn't make any sense. Even the FDA's costs were directly estimated at $4 billion. And the entire budget of the FDA globally for a year for everything it does is $8 billion. This would be $4 billion. So it just made no sense at all, which led me to spend several days making that 15-page white paper.
Right, nothing better to do in your spare time, but I appreciate the attention and detail, and maybe we can talk about the kind of both sides of the issue, or actually I'll give you some, like, for the next round of questions, think about some other highlights that people reading just even the proposed language might not have picked up on, because I think that's what some of what you did was try to kind of read between the lines very well. So let me go back to Susan. Let's talk about the Valid Act a little bit, because that really would have given, I think, as you mentioned, because of all the time put in, not just by the industry, but by patient groups. I mean, I feel like I kind of lived some of those conversations myself, and it was really around having a regulatory framework that could do, I think there was no argument that lab developed tests needed kind of a better pathway, and the FDA certainly had, instead of this discretion of enforcement authority, wanted to kind of shift a little bit in its tone. What, like, just if you don't mind, like,
Mhm.
were there some moments, and as you saw when Valid didn't happen and what we knew might have happened with this proposed language, like how have you mentioned working with the agency, what have you been doing? Now we're in this open comment period, so that is very straightforward, but kind of up until this proposed language came out. And then if you don't mind adding some color, some of what we try to do at Stanford in this policy program is kind of put the layer behind the scenes, like you, myself, like other Bruce, a lot of us kind of constantly interact with the agencies. And I try to demystify a little bit of this, that these are really well-intentioned people who like want to do the right thing
Mhm.
all across the board. So do you mind just talking about, like, kind of, the work with the agency to date prior to the release of the language? Also, their thoughts about the Valid Act. You mentioned the legal issues,
Mhm.
but I do think this will promote Congress coming back to it. I don't know what that'll look like, but maybe you do, kind of where that is. And then I've asked a lot of you, but if you don't mind just giving some aha or kind of insight that maybe the kind of audience might not be aware of to describe like how this sausage gets made and your observations.
Sure. I mean, I think, just starting from the decision we made to engage with the FDA around the legislation. And as I had mentioned, we really did think that the VALID Act was viable. And it had gotten further than any other prior version of a diagnostics regulatory reform bill had ever gotten. And in large part, that was because of the partnership between Patty Murray, who was the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, a Democrat out of Washington State, who's now chair of the Appropriations Committee, incidentally, and Richard Burr, the aforementioned Richard Burr, former senator from North Carolina. It was through their committee that they actually approved a version of the VALID Act. And our experience engaging with both of those offices and their committee staff was very favorable, right? It was intensive. It was many, many months long. And rather detailed oriented. For any of you who have opened the VALID Act, it is just about the most complex piece of legislation certainly I've ever worked on. I've been doing this kind of thing for quite a while. So honestly, a very positive experience in that engagement. They took the issue seriously around how do we make sure that patients continue to have access to tests, and that the beauty of diagnostics is that we can innovate rapidly, and we need a regulatory apparatus that can help keep pace with the speed of innovation. And I think there were a lot of important conversations around that. And with the agency, again, positive engagement. They were open to a lot of new ideas. And so a few of the things in the VALID Act, which we don't think was perfect, right? We know it would have been a heavy lift to implement, but what it cleared up what is, again, that gray area that oftentimes can stand in the way of innovation. If you have gray area of your regulatory apparatus, it can be a disincentive to moving forward with certain types of technology. Key attributes of VALID included a rather robust grandfathering. In other words, tests that were already on the market up to a certain number of days before enactment could remain on the market. The agency would have the authority to go back and take a look at those tests if there were problems, which we think is important and appropriate. And then there was a timeline that was at least 5 years of implementation. But for test developers that brought their tests through New York State, as you all know, New York State has a really rather robust risk-based review program. And the agency has confidence in New York State's program. So that timeline could be extended to 10 years for any molecular test that went through New York State. And obviously that's where, cutting edge tests are happening in the molecular space, genetic testing. So we thought that was really important. I'll just mention one additional item that is going to be absent from this rule because the FDA doesn't have the authority under law. And that was for a pathway called technology certification. In short, based on the health of the test developer, Tech Cert would have allowed for a whole suite of assays to be approved or cleared by the agency based on the review of a sample assay. We think that's very important, right, to be able to have that kind of efficiency in review. And most importantly, in that pathway, you would be able to iterate on your tests post-market and inform the FDA of that iteration within a certain agreed upon scope. That's important. That's how mechanisms like that are how we think a proper regulatory framework that's diagnostic specific can be developed, because you can allow that iteration on a test in order to meet the needs of patients. And maybe I'll just add one more thing here before I turn it back. But you'd also mentioned, Kavita, just thinking about small patient populations, right? The importance of having tests to ensure, like for rare diseases, for example, that there are tests to meet the needs for patients. VALID contemplated that, I think, in an imperfect way. But with this current rule, there is no exemption for rare disease tests. There are countless LDTs that are the only test available for certain patient populations. Let me give you a couple of examples. For sick babies in the neonate setting, there is rapid whole genomic sequencing that we know from studies out of Rady's children in Southern California that there has been tremendous benefit to patients for early diagnosis and treatment in a significant proportion of cases, and that is cost effective, in this case for the Medicaid program in California over time. Those are LDTs. As we think about, do laboratories actually generate sufficient revenue from those tests that it warrants the investment in developing a submission for the agency? I worry a lot about that. There are a lot of LDTs for which, frankly, a 510K submission is probably more than the annual revenue of some of these tests for which the volume is low or the reimbursement is modest. So that's an area that this rule does not address, that I think is enormously important.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Bruce, let me go over to you. And I'm going to call out, you already mentioned kind of an aspect in your paper where you flesh out like the economic impact, both to the agency and to any developers, entrepreneurs. If you have anything to underscore there. The other thing that I noticed in your paper that I found interesting was kind of your analysis on the health benefits, because
Absolutely.
Would you
Yes.
mind just, again, we'll cite, I do have to mention that I think, I remember thinking your website had the best website name, which you must have gotten, kind of when they were releasing website names, but you can point people to the website and then we'll send a link to the paper.
Well, the website is called Discoveries in Health Policy. The first part of my life's career was as a med school professor for 10 years, where you're discovering things. And then I moved into policy and strategy, where I find you're also discovering things, but it's a different kind of discovery than science. So so the benefits, they just say extremely briefly in the press release or the Federal Register that the benefits would be about $30 billion a year or up to $80 billion a year, and the cost would be a few $1 billion. But it's very strange because they're talking about abstract quality of life or longevity benefits, and they're comparing those with no warning against cash costs of many tens of billions of dollars. If you dig into this, they say nothing in their easy to reach publications, but if you dig into footnote 34, the 100-page online supplement, they have 30 pages about how they calculated benefits. And they're very loosey-goosey extrapolations and guesswork. They calculate that the benefits in lifespan saved could be as much as $80 billion a year, or over their 20-year horizon, $1.6 trillion. Well, if you took their arguments and sent a letter to New England Journal that labs are killing $1.6 trillion of Americans right now, the New England Journal would laugh you out the door. If you did a class action lawsuit saying labs are causing $1.6 trillion of premature death, with their argument, the court would laugh you out the door. So it's a terrible approach for something that should be so important.
Any additional commentary regarding the kind of, have you, I feel like you and I probably talked to some of the FDA staff, but I do kind of take the point that there was a very senior person kind of in the agency that also said, look, this was all it is well-intentioned, and yet we're not even sure about the feasibility. And you pointed out, just from a cost perspective, simply to the agency to carry out, maybe something listeners are aware of or not, is that the agency is constantly in a fight getting back to, how much, keep in mind all of their other priorities and the staffing required to carry out just what they have on the books, much less changes that they're making, although that gets done behind the scenes in terms of what the Office of Management and Budget sees as like an impact to what the agencies might need in terms of budget. Bruce, do you have any other additional, as a follow-up, insights into how prepared are the staff to do this? Because that timeline, it's not as if doing PMA 510, these are not easy processes, even though 510K, and I was around when that got developed, it's a victim of its own success. It's kind of now seen as this better pathway, which is what it was intended to be, but certainly not an easy one to slip LDTs into. Do you have insights into that or conversations?
Well, absolutely. For one thing, they're extremely unclear, and when you get closer to it, it just gets foggier. What they would not require to be reviewed. They say it's tests that are like 1976 tests. They would not require review.
does that mean?
Anybody who is a 40 or 50-year-old lab director in 1976 is in his or her 90s now and probably dead. So Jeff Shurn had a wonderful quote in the New York Times, October 30th, where he said that we're dealing with 50-year-old laws and they have got to be legally revised. We have to have new statutes. Now, when he said that, he was talking about artificial intelligence in that article, but it equally applies to 1976 laws in genomics. And the entire 510K versus PMA structure is based on what was and wasn't marketed at midnight on May 28th, 1976.
Yeah.
It's a crazy way to try to do things today on that count alone. And they make very, very confusing what would be actually in or out at the level of somewhat simpler tests, but you can't tell what's in or out on this the lower side. Very, very poorly written.
Well, that's it. I remember Jeff talking about that around AI, which actually that article highlighted kind of what I would say is, at least from an agency perspective in the artificial intelligence area, more advanced thinking. I would say the FDA has been doing it. They're hindered by that statute. However, I would say as an agency, and Jeff certainly in his center has led a lot of those areas, which I think parts of, the arms of the government are actually watching, because they're some of the more advanced in terms of thinking through applications of AI, regulatory, regulation. Started with software as a medical device, starting kind of a lot of these issues have come up. But you're right. I chuckled because I've often looked at some of the existing language in the food, kind of in the Cosmetics Act, Food and Drug Administration Cosmetics Act, and kind of laughed at the Public Health Services Act in general, which all of this is inside of. Sandy, maybe we can circle back to, maybe bring us to, we've been talking about kind of various like treetops, kind of sort of to the grassroots, the most important grassroots around the patient. Can you speak to like how to think through, if you're sitting with, you were an innovation fellow graduate of the Stanford program, if you're sitting with someone today, an innovation fellow who is going through kind of the, biodesign needs finding process, which basically takes people and kind of immerses them in a clinical environment so that it's not just ideas on a PowerPoint or what might make a lot of money. It's actually being informed by clinical need. Can you see where the kind of rubber might hit the road in a difficult way, discouraging that arm of innovation? If I were an innovation fellow in the program today, I would probably take away from this webinar, steer clear of anything LDT or related to LDTs. Is that a fair assessment? Or maybe kind of walk through where this could have, a real unintended or somewhat intended impact on innovation. And then maybe because you do a lot of work and kind of involved in like strategic work with companies that already do have something commercial or pre-commercial, kind of thinking about how that could also be affecting that sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Kavita, you're really bringing up the challenge, particularly in the diagnostic space, of going from the identification of a need and the identification of an opportunity to how that opportunity comes to market and actually reaches patients. And I think most people will traditionally think of using venture capital as that mechanism for fundraising. Start with grants, start at the university, and then use venture capital as that mechanism. And I think anyone who's thinking around the diagnostics space, unfortunately, I do think some of this is going to have it is going to make it challenging to develop molecular diagnostics if you are going to try to raise money and fund it through the venture community. That said, I do think that you see around here at Biodesign quite a bit, more and more, the very targeted type of project that's highly, highly focused on an incredibly important patient need. It may be a very small opportunity, and the use of impact investors, government grants, and angel investors as a form and mechanism for funding, to bring that technology to patients. And I think if I was thinking about how to advise a student team who's trying to do this, I think they're really going to have to try to thread the needle around the fundraising side. That unless there is a enormous market opportunity that so a large number of patients or the potential for a high revenue test, that it's going to be quite difficult to secure a venture funding behind one of these with the additional expectation of going through, for instance, a PMA and then securing additional coverage at the end of it. Now, on the we should back up and just say this is the challenge of coming through FDA as a medical device and then securing coverage is a universal challenge around many health technologies. And so, if anything, if you look at the timelines paper that we just published, molecular assays actually were doing better, or diagnostic assays in general were statistically significantly faster in our timelines research for securing coverage. So I think that we shouldn't expect that this is somehow going to explode the world of innovation in medical, in diagnostics and in LDTs. I think there will still be ways to bring important tests to patients. But it's going to take a more creativity, and I think it's going to take a lot more attention to how you create a project plan that comes through the FDA and as streamlined a process as possible.
Great, and thank you for probably pointing out from the timelines paper what included in there kind of would have benefited, not from the proposed rule, but that all is not lost. Maybe an innovation fellow today doesn't need to say, oh, I would stay away from this, but probably thinking a little bit more methodically about how to do this. All right, we're going to do, we are going to do this. It's not fair because I'm asking a lightning round question, same one to all three of you. That's a bit of a setup, but try to play along. I want to ask each of you to pretend you're Rob Califf, the commissioner of the FDA, and you are going to, there's going to be an incredible number of staff who bring together all the comments. We're in the open comment period, so anybody who's got thoughts on this, doesn't matter length, appetite, put them in today, put them in now, because the staff actually read every single comment, and they'll put this together and think about this. I have yet to see, I was trying to remember in my career, there have been times when proposed rules get taken down. Those tend to be around times of changes in leaders or administrations, or there's reasons for that, but they're not common. So let's go with the kind of assumption that this doesn't all just get taken down, or let's put aside the legal issues, because I think those are real. You're sitting as the commissioner and you have to think about some modifications. I can suspect. We'll start with Susan. I have a suspicion. I know some of these, but what are some of the must-haves in this final rule that you would need to see, and you would have to think about if you're the commissioner signing off on this through chains of clearance? What would be some of the hey, Jeff, I'm looking for this, and this. What are some of those pearls? Susan, start with you, and around the horn, Bruce and Sandy.
Yeah, and look, I think you just said something that's really important, right? We have a lot of innovators on this webinar today. Like, this is an opportunity, weigh in, right? You have until December 3rd to submit a comment. You can easily do it on the Federal Register website. Explain, leverage Bruce's work. Think about, that innovation that you're contemplating that can really make a difference in patients' lives, and explain why this rule would have a blunting impact. I think that's incredibly important. We're doing that. We have very robust comments under development. So if I'm Commissioner Califf, I might reflect on conversations that I've had with members of the ACLA board about how we think this rule would have that negative impact on access and innovation. And you might think that part of what FDA is doing here is not necessarily putting out a proposed rule they think they're going to implement. So I think we'll see some changes in the final. But, perhaps they're trying to get discussion and dialogue, kick-started again on the Hill. And I'm going to be optimistic that that's a big driving force behind this, because we know from talking to the commissioner privately and from things he said publicly that the agency really wants legislation. Right? They want to be able to have a framework that's diagnostic specific. I would like to think that that is really informing a lot of this effort here, right? So I would anticipate there'll be changes in that final rule. Perhaps they'll reflect items like grandfathering, rare disease for testing, lengthening the timeline, contemplating more specifics about the types of tests that they want to see, really leveraging third-party reviewers like New York State, and others. I think we might see some of that, but what I'm hoping most of all, again, is that this becomes a vehicle to re-engage on the Hill so that there can be a more fulsome effort that is more reflective of how technology changes and the needs of patients. And I think you have to do that through legislation. So that's slightly not answering your question, but
no,
that's what I'm really hoping is happening here, because long and short of it is, and maybe I'd love to hear Bruce talk about this too, they can't implement this rule, right?
Yeah,
and frankly, they shouldn't.
They physically cannot with what they have. Bruce, your thoughts. What are some must-haves if you're the commissioner?
Yeah, no, I'll follow what Susan said. You couldn't fix this rule in a second phase. You'd have to start over again. So I think there's no alternative to that. But I would take a goal-oriented approach. They want to be sure that tests are safe. So you'd have something much more like the New York State level of review, not giving New York State 510K rules, but the actual New York State level of review. And you could replicate that. That would be a different approach. In fact, that would be simpler than valid. And then second, something that is a problem is that unlike regular devices and drugs, claims in LDTs are completely uncontrolled claims, and those can be bad actors sometimes. So you'd have to have some way of controlling claims, but it wouldn't have to cost $100 billion and 100,000 staff. You'd find some other way to do it also through legislation.
I love it. I've got 2 nominees for commissioner here so far. Sandy, you can be the third. I can tell you, I will say this, I've worked on 2 presidential transitions, and coming up with names for the commissioner that can get confirmed through Congress, not that easy. So I'm glad I'm going to get the 2 of you to volunteer. All right, Sandy, you're the commissioner. Things you got to see on this. Not going to have everything you want probably, but some things you must have.
Yeah, I think, both Susan and Bruce have talked about how the rule isn't implementable at all in the shape that it has come forward at the moment. I guess I would take the converse side, which is to say, if you were to try to move forward with implementing it, a really narrow focus on how to minimize the amount of staff resources required to implement the rule and to do these review. So beyond guidance documents, there may need to be some forms of automation or some forms of format and formulas associated with how to bring products through here. It's just a huge lift on the agency side. So I'd be squarely focused on that as the commissioner.
Okay, great. And we got a question, and Susan actually tackled this because I think she cited just submit your comments, like have a point of view. One person can submit. You don't need to come in the form of Stanford or an association. You can just submit it as an individual. Some of you might already be doing that. But the question was asked, like, all of what we're talking about is very rational, reasonable, and practical. How do we actually kind of translate some of this in order to, to stakeholders in DC to actually create action that also makes sense? And by the way, I think that's a lot of what's the underpinning for having created a policy program within a place like Stanford Biodesign, which for decades have been the place where this incredible thought happens. I am going to take the side of a conversation I was a part of, and this was in the Obama administration. I was out of the government at that point, but it was when it was 2000. I had to look it up. I had to look up the date. It was November 2013 when the FDA sent a warning letter. And was it Caliph or Hamburg? It might have been Caliph. I can't remember. Anyway, the FDA sent a warning letter to 23andMe around it, asking the company to discontinue the marketing of its personal genome service test until they got FDA clearance for the test. And then again, several years later, and this was under CALIF, I believe, FDA sent letters to companies marketing to kind of the direct-to-consumer genetic tests without FDA clearance. Pathway Genomics was one of them. And they felt like this was, I really saw myself kind of, if I were to offer, and then I'll see if anybody has any kind of closing thoughts and they can shout out. If I were to offer very practical guidance, it's an acknowledgement that there needed to be, that the kind of onslaught of direct-to-consumer testing, first with genetics, now with everything that we love of having DTC, that there have been some times where we needed the FDA to step in and where it could not be just an enforcement action, and that really is like an underpinning. And I think balancing that by bringing it back to how this would actually take away incredible opportunities to make early, and not just early diagnosis, but ongoing monitoring for patients, and bringing that into like something that's convenient and, evidence-based, quality assurance, all of that. That's what's at cost and tension here. So I do feel like this is something that we should just, not we, the four of us, but like in general, we have to acknowledge that it wasn't just one or two people, that there was a feeling that consumers were being swindled. And I can say it because I certainly remember like the conversations around kind of the tables. And I think that was where the FDA felt very much like this is their authority. And I would say that's so one piece of advice in trying to bring about change is kind of acknowledging that like there had been a time that where this has gone in a way that we 100% agree should not have happened. Here are the ways we will never let that happen again. And so I'll offer that. I don't know, Susan, Bruce, Sandy, any other practical ways people can have an impact so that all of what we discuss comes forward, but people kind of see it and say, the action that we need to take is the following. Any other pieces of advice?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just underscore again, get comments in, right? I think it's important, even if it's a paragraph, you can easily submit that. And, Bruce made a point earlier that said, there are alternatives to what the FDA has proposed, even alternatives to the VALID Act, which we'd quite agree with, right? Let's move towards a system that is diagnostic specific, that removes that gray area that can hamper innovation, that puts in place the kind of safeguards you're talking about, whether it's around marketing or test performance, right? There's a lot of oversight right now of tests, but it is not comprehensive. So, right. I can see a role for the FDA, but it needs to be thoughtful. It needs to balance that access and innovation, and it needs to be diagnostic specific. And so I would, in my comments, if I'm an individual, say, not the right direction, but let's recommit to an effort that involves the Hill, that creates that diagnostic specific framework. It is time. Like that, the medical device apparatus has far outlived its usefulness, in my personal opinion, for diagnostic manufacturers. I think it's time that we all move forward as a community. So that would be my suggestion.
Great. Any other closing thoughts? And if not, I know we've got maybe one quick question, 2 minutes, maybe Bruce, if you see it, it's has there been any attempt, or Sandy or Susan, has there been any attempt to estimate not just actual costs of implementing FDA regulation, but the opportunity costs because fewer tests are brought to the market? I put that to you, Bruce. Is that something you thought about, or?
I haven't thought about that directly, but I think the 100-page supplement mentions that, whoever the economist was mentioned that, but said he couldn't make any estimates and he skipped over it. But it's the words are there for a sentence.
Okay, perfect. And I do think that's nobody yes, I think there's been mention, and especially in oncology, this can be very relevant. All right. So in true fashion, I'm going to end on time, but I want to end by thanking all of our panelists and encourage, we're going to have anybody who is watching this recording, please do submit comments, whether it's on behalf of an individual, a company, a set of people. I think that's the best way. They actually do get read, and I do think that they have an impact. And we invite you to join us. Have a safe holiday season. We'll resume our policy webinar series in the new year, and we are hopeful that we will have some updates on this LDT proposed rule then. Thanks, everyone.